In the beginning of 2024, Marvel resurrected the Ultimate Universe line of commercial success. And as always, DC tried to copy them almost a year later.
Copy my whole fucking flow!
Oh,
word for word, bar for bar!
This isn't the first time that DC has tried to copy Marvel. Hell, it's not even the first time that they've copied this exact idea. It's become a great tradition at this point. And not just from DC, Marvel does this shit as well.
Deadpool?
Deadpool? What? I'm not Deadpool. By the way, he should be saying that he's not me. Okay, because I came out like way before he did.
Nah, I'm pretty sure you're Deadpool.
I knew way back in 2023 when the Ultimate Universe was first coming back that DC would try to do their own thing, their own version, as Marvel has continued to outpace them in terms of output and sales. Heck, they even copied the naming scheme. They just used a synonym for Ultimate.
They're the same picture.
And I mean, I don't really have a problem with comic books ripping each other off. Like I said, it's a great tradition at this point, but I do have an issue with how you go about it, especially when it's not done well. The original and the new Ultimate Universes were founded on a very simple premise of reinvigorating classic characters in new and interesting ways, mostly keeping the core aspects of them, but in a new recontextualized setting. The original 1610 Earth was a contemporary take on classic superheroes, with the lofty goal of being a little bit more grounded, like making death actually matter. Until it didn't, I guess. This new 6160 Earth diverges a lot more, but with the added context of the world being actively messed with by an egomaniac that's trying to prevent the birth of the superheroes. Kind of like a reverse baby Hitler situation. And neither of these universes are perfect, otherwise they wouldn't need to reboot them in the first place, but it's obvious to see why they succeeded when all of the previous DC attempts failed, All-Star Line, Earth 1, even the New 52 if you want to think about it like that. Well, at least this time they're actually sticking to their guts and releasing more books, but I do have some fears about the potential problems the Absolute Universe might be facing. Specifically, with the foundation of how this world was created, and the edgy reinterpretations of both the characters that really just kinda seem to be sanding off iconic elements of these characters.
Seriously, I don't even know why you're here. What's the difference? I'm the Batman. You're Batman. Okay. I don't mean to be Sean Parker here, but you can drop the. Nobody wants to go to the Facebook.
But first, I want to talk about the whole inception of the Absolute Universe. Both the new Ultimate and Absolute Universe have one very interesting thing in common. The fact that two supervillains, the Maker and Darkseid, both remade their universes in their own respective image. Where they do differ though is how they went about it. In the Ultimate Universe, the Maker, aka the original Ultimate Reed Richards, entered Earth 6160 in the mid-20th century and sabotaged the origins of several heroes like the Fantastic Four and Spider-Man. He does this with his prerequisite knowledge of how these events usually play out, and uses this to remake the literal world into his own image, including dissolving the United States. But there are some things that he can't prevent, like the origin of the Hulk and finding Captain America's frozen body. This kind of demonstrates that despite having all this knowledge and power and being a very intimidating foe, he is not unstoppable, and the fact that there is a chance that some heroes will rise to stop his regime. The characters themselves that exist in the Ultimate Universe are heroes actually aren't that different from the mainline versions.
I'm Spider-Man. I need you to come with me.
Who the heck are you?
I just told you that. Listen.
What they do differ in is the fact that the Makers stopped their original origins, so they received their powers and responsibilities at different points in their lives, showing how these same heroes might have acted in situations where things were a little different. Like Peter, who now has to balance his life as Spider-Man and a family man, working a full-time job but without the same early history of crime fighting. It's also probably the only way that Marvel editorial will ever let Peter get with MJ. Darkseid's approach is a lot different, but before I get into that, I want to talk about Darkseid as a character. And I want to say, I know it's a little controversial, but Darkseid's just not that interesting.
You need to leave!
I know, people like the power levels, they like the Omega Beams, but if you search your heart, you know it to be true. As a character, Darkseid is just a generic, boring space warlord that is eclipsed by his own ripoff Thanos. His whole goal of trying to find the anti-life equation so he can enslave all of the universe is, it's just kind of just evil. It doesn't really say anything interesting about his character. And it's not helped by the fact that the new DC cosmology has made him the literal multiversal constant of evil that is always destined to lose to Superman. The most interesting thing about this guy is the fact that Santa trolls him every Christmas and he's powerless to stop him. So in Darkseid's approach to creating the Absolute Universe, he goes about it by creating a bunch of MacGuffins, a literal Deus Ex Machina, and kills a bunch of jobbers to merge himself with the Spectre, the little wrath of God, so he can fight and then kinda die to the Justice League, but he doesn't actually die. Instead, he grafts his energy and existence onto a new universe, Earth Alpha, and recreates in his own image, thus beginning the Absolute Universe. It's all kind of complicated cosmic mumbo jumbo, but the way Snyder, not that one, the architect of the Absolute Universe describes it, it's at Earth Prime, the good world, it runs on Superman energy. And this world, Earth Alpha, the edgy world, runs on Darkseid energy. What does this mean, I guess? I don't know, I guess Batman is poor now. He's not poor in the main universe, he's poor in this one. It's strange to me because with all the supposed influence and power Darkseid has in this universe, he literally made it after his own image. The only way he can impede the heroes is not by trying to stop them from existing, but by making things a little harder, making them the small chaos against the system. But I don't know if he knows this, Superman and Batman are always kind of reacting to the system. Batman fights corrupt crime, Superman fights literally billionaires that became president. I don't really know what they mean by that. How it actually manifests though is that things are a little less convenient for our heroes. Batman has got no money or mansion, Wonder Woman has no island or Amazon, Superman has no fortress or family. It's a really strange setup because despite all of his power, Darkseid managed to do less to impede the heroes than crazy old Reed Richards. And I'm sure there's an explanation about how on the multiversal level, Darkseid needed Superman to balance himself out, otherwise the world wouldn't exist, but it just feels like a contrived way to create a new universe that's darker and edgier that literally runs on Darkseid energy. But enough yapping about irrelevant cosmic side shit that won't show up until some super duper dark crisis event happens. Let's talk about the actual meat of the Absolute Universe, and boy, this bat's got a lot of meat on them wings. Absolute Batman is an even darker take on the Dark Knight, but not quite the darkest. A Batman without the money, without the mansion, without the butler. So instead of beating up poor people, this time he's poor.
What a twist!
Before I get too negative, I want to say I do like the art. Nick Dragotta's art was the best part of East of West for me. And despite the fact that Scott Snyder has written absolute slop in the past, he has produced Batman stories that I actually kind of like. At this point, there are only 2 issues out of Absolute Muscle Man, so my opinion is subject to change. In this version of Gotham, Bruce has much humbler beginnings, the son of a school teacher who was tragically killed during a school trip to the zoo, saving the class and Bruce by locking them in a bad exhibit. You can imagine what happened after that. Now Gotham is plagued by the party animals, a newer, more violent breed of criminals that required a newer, more violent form of justice. It's a kind of a similar premise to what we've seen in a lot of Batman stories, but I think where the biggest differences are not in the fact that Batman doesn't have his mansion or money, it's the changes made to Bruce Wayne's personal life. Like I said, he isn't a billionaire, he isn't a playboy, he isn't a philanthropist, but he's a humble city engineer that somehow has the time and money to wage a full-time crusade against crime while also working a 9-to-5. He's also childhood friends with several of his iconic villains like Killer Croc, Penguin, and Two-Face. This is one of the tropes I kind of hate about superheroes when they're friends with one of their iconic rogues, because usually the fallout is always the same. It's something that's extremely cliche and has been done a lot, and I haven't been impressed with most of them. And here it's kind of even worse because he's friends with almost half of them, he has way too many of them, and I don't know how it's going to turn out, but this is already a red flag to me personally. But one of the most important changes made so far is the fact that Martha Wayne is actually alive and is present in his life. And no, she's not the crazy Joker in this timeline. And I think this is really one of the most interesting changes you could make to Batman as a character. There are plenty of iterations that are friends with like his rogues. He's even been poor and had Alfred killed multiple times in the mainline universe. But having one of his parents, especially Martha, being alive is one of the more unique takes that Snyder could have gone with. Martha already represents a potentially interesting angle into the psychology about how this iteration of Bruce came to be, and her scenes talking with Gordon are some of the best character moments that we've had in the comics so far. However, this isn't really the bulk of the first couple of issues, and this version of Bruce, this version of Batman outside of his fights hasn't really grabbed me yet. The bulk of these issues actually framed around Alfred Pennyworth's monologue, who is some kind of super spy mercenary, which isn't the first either, as he's been sent in to investigate the party animals and later tasked with eliminating the Batman. Of course, Alfred doesn't actually do this and instead teams up with Batman to stop the party animals and the guy behind them, Black Mask. So far, it seems like a pretty standard Batman plot with some interesting twists into his personal life that are really mired by a lot of uninteresting changes that they've made to him that really serve no purpose, and in fact, they kind of raise more questions. But at the moment, I am enthusiastic because I really do enjoy the visuals and the action of the first 2 issues. There are some nitpicks like how retarded the bat symbol is, and the fact that it's actually an axe head doesn't make it any less stupid. I do like that he chops people's hands off though. Very edgy, very cool. Everything else about the design is cool. I wasn't sold on the fact that his Batcave would also act as like these weird impromptu stilts, or he could use them as like hooks to throw people, but the way the combat flows, mainly due to the Grota's art, and even the fact that Batman is like absolute unit in this version, I'm really glad that despite going for a grittier iteration of Batman, I'm glad they kind of took that chance to try to go for a darker story with a less conventional art style. And for that reason alone, I'll probably keep reading the story and see where the story goes, especially when they begin introducing their own takes on some of the villains that we are all waiting to really see. Out of all the Absolute titles, this is probably the one that I cared for the least. Not because she's a woman, but because she's Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman as a character is just someone that I don't have a lot of affinity with. I don't have any particular deep knowledge about her character, and I haven't read any of her runs outside of the New 52. I've read a lot of comics that she's appeared in, but I just don't know a lot about her. And whenever she does show up, she doesn't really have that consistency. So I don't really have the knowledge to appreciate any of the potential twists to her origin, supporting cast, or villains. And I know a lot of people like Wonder Woman. She had a pretty good movie, and she was also a big part of that Justice League cartoon that everybody likes. But I think this is where her series has a disadvantage. The very nature of Wonder Woman's mythos is way too convoluted, and it changes way too much for anyone who isn't a big fan to have a solid grasp on her identity, at least in my opinion. Her powers, her weapons, her origins, hell, even her character seems to change based on whatever author is writing her. She can be made out of clay, at the same time being the daughter of Zeus somehow. She can be bulletproof, but for some reason she needs bracelets to deflect bullets. She can be an ambassador for peace, while also being the only member of the Trinity that's willing to kill people. It just changes way too much. So while Absolute Wonder Woman does start with Diana riding a skeletal Pegasus with a giant gut sword using dark magic to fight off demons, I can't help but feel that her character hasn't really changed from any version that you might see in the mainline universe, outside of her appearance and maybe her powers. In this version, Diana has been raised in hell instead of paradise, and not by her Amazon sisters, but instead one of her main villains in the main universe, the sorceress Circe. And I just want to say her character doesn't really reflect that much difference. Also, I'm not the biggest fan of Kelly Thompson as a writer. She did that one Energon Universe miniseries Scarlet, and it just wasn't my cup of tea. Something about the voices of the characters and the dialogue doesn't just really interest me. And I think a lot of these issues carry over with my problems with Wonder Woman. But I've been pretty negative so far. Why don't I talk about the actual book? Well, compared to the first 2 issues of Absolute Batman and the first issue of Absolute Superman, it feels really compressed. But this has only been the first 2 issues, so my opinion can change. And this is also a kind of concern that I had with Scarlet. The changes made to Diana are not really realized, because even though she's raised in hell and she's probably had a much tougher childhood, she still is a generally nice seeming person. It's probably like the least edgy or least aggressive out of all of the characters in this. Most of this comic so far has just been Diana battling demonic harbingers in Gateway City, as well as flashback to her childhood in hell and her first encounter with Steve Rogers. Which, honestly, if you just change the setting, would kind of fit right in with her characterization in the main universe. It definitely feels like the weakest title for me so far, especially because the art isn't good enough to carry this kind of story. I actually don't mind the edgelord Wonder Woman design with the giant gut sword. It's just that the line art and the colors don't really click with me the same way it did with the Grota, who really manages to ride the line between expressive and gritty. This one just kind of feels a little bit too lighthearted and cartoony, despite that this world is supposed to be, running on Darkseid energy. But beyond that, I just really can't feel what they're going for. And I don't really feel like it's the author's fault, When comparing Wonder Woman to guys like Batman or Superman, she doesn't really have a lot of famous or iconic alternative takes or alternate versions, despite being around about as long as the rest of them. And that's because the foundation of Wonder Woman itself feels kind of shaky. Beyond just her origins, which changes a lot due to constant reboots and hyper-time bullshit, it feels more about her character traits and identity. If you had to define Wonder Woman based on all of her appearance throughout media, there is no concept because she changes a lot. She exists now as an icon of feminism, despite having started out as some weird professor's fetishist. She is defined as a warrior while also being a pacifist. She exists as a 1,000-year-old demigod while also being somehow a sheltered princess. This is why alternate Wonder Woman takes like Absolute Wonder Woman stand out so much less compared to Batman and Superman. Because there isn't really a standard that you can solidly deviate from. Because if you really think about it, compared to Batman, who, despite 100 years worth of stories, is pretty much defined as a billionaire crime fighter pretending to be a playboy, and Superman, who is almost always the last son of an ancient civilization. Through persistent cultural osmosis, these characters have become so iconic and so solid that it's become very easy to take alternate versions of them, which is why even those alternate versions, like the evil Superman trope, have become tropes into themselves. So why do I bother bringing this up? Because at the end of the day, I feel like this story is the one that's least set up to take advantage of this universe. The comic itself might end up improving. Like I said, it's only been 2 issues, but unlike the other 2, I don't really see where it could go. I don't really feel the potential where this story could deviate that much from Wonder Woman. But nevertheless, I'll probably read it for the next year or so, just to see how things turn out. I've bitched enough about Batman and Wonder Woman. Let's talk about the man who started it all, and I mean that literally. He's the reason why Darkseid did all this shit. Superman has the least amount of wiggle room for this kind of story, because despite the fact that characters like Batman are inherent edgelords, he actually has a much greater balance in his presentations. Between his more darker counterparts like the Batman or the Dark Knight Returns, to his more adventurous James Bond-esque versions like the Brave and the Bold.
The engine of his infernal steam-powered suit.
Aim for that valve.
Superman tends to exist more in extremes, from either being a goody two-shoes Boy Scout to a genocidal dictator. And most of it isn't really his fault, because there's only a fraction of the evil Supermen that are presented today are the Man of Steel himself.
I'm like, what did he say fuck me for?
Modern comics has an obsession with portraying Superman in all kinds of negative extremes with not nearly enough heroic interpretations to balance it all out. So when Absolute Superman promises a darker iteration of Superman, it's competing in a space where it's already been dominated by darker Supermen of every type, from the tyrannical dictators to the psychopathic corporate assholes to the even morally ambiguous aliens. Any step into any of these extremes are just going to draw a comparison to a lot of these stories, because they are simply just everywhere. So what kind of dark take do we get in this story? Well, the first thing is Superman has no family and has no Fortress of Solitude. The Superman is generally described as being abused and endangered by the Lazarus corporations and their peacemakers. The majority of this issue, however, is actually set on Krypton and the events that led up to its destruction. Most of it is pretty standard with some interesting world building stuff, except for 2 big changes. The Superman emblem, the S, is no longer the symbol of House L, and instead the symbol of the Laborers Guild. And Clark, or I guess more accurately Kal, has actually been raised on Krypton before it was destroyed. So far, I feel like the actual take that they went with is just nuanced enough to actually work. I feel like this version of Kal has a lot of potential. The obvious theme that the story is going for is the classic ecological concern with things like the destruction of Krypton and how obviously industry and science refused to acknowledge it, which led to its collapse. But there's also some more interesting angles that they're pushing, specifically going for a more revolutionary Superman, which is a little bit on the nose with the whole symbol being the emblem of the Laborers Guild. But I do enjoy this comparison, and even the way that he designs and talks, he's kind of reminiscent of Paul Atreides. You know, I kind of call him Kal Atreides because he's got that same kind of attitude and revolutionary vibe. Kal, in his portrayal so far, has a very limited reminiscence to the original Man of Steel Clark Kent, especially with the way that he adjusts to his power level and his overall disposition as an outsider that doesn't fit in. Superman was always very quintessentially human, the man of tomorrow, showing humanity what they could possibly be. Here, he's a lot more brooding and a lot less in control. His whole brooding hobo thing is actually very reminiscent to Superman from Man of Steel, whose number one complaint was the fact that he was too alien and too dark, which, hey, this fits better in here. So it's actually kind of fitting to see this, and I do enjoy the angle to see how they're going to go about him taking a more revolutionary stance, since, like I said, he's always been a person that battles against, billionaires like Lex Luthor. The art and design so far are very sufficient to keep my entrance. It does feel a lot more DC house style, and I think I read somewhere that his cape is actually made from the particle dust of like the destroyed planet, which I'll have to say is pretty cool and pretty edgy. I know it's kind of stupid, but I like little details like that. I hope that's true. I hope I didn't just make that up. They'll also be setting it up with some kind of limit on his powers, because a big complaint about Superman in most interpretation is that he is too strong. So obviously, since he probably came here at a lot older age, he hasn't adjusted to it as much, and there's probably going to be some element of him having to manage his power more. And it's also one of the few changes made that I feel like will actually have an impact on Superman's ability to be a nuisance to Darkseid, making his powers work differently, or having him not be as proficient so that when he actually shows up, he'll have a better chance against him. It kind of makes it feel like the situation is a little bit more dire. But there's only been one issue so far, which is far less than what we got with Batman and Wonder Woman. I'm sure that there's potential to mess up this premise or do it even better in the next couple of issues, but just from this first issue, I think that I've been pretty much grabbed by this story. So what was even the point of this video? Well, it's just an avenue for me to talk about the Absolute Universe and what I like or dislike about it. I might come off a little bit negative, but I really have hope that the Absolute Universe maintains its momentum. DC in the last 10 years has really been a story of a lot of ill-advised attempts to launch underbaked initiatives that crumble within a year. And so far, it seems like the Absolute Universe is really a hit, it's catching on, it's making sales, and I hope it continues for at least a little bit. Having a decent alternate line that is unrestricted by a hyper time and continuity is great, but I am sure that there are multiversal shenanigans that are baked into this concept that will come up sooner rather than later. If that's something that really seems designed to be a jumping on point for people in the same way the New 52 was, but I'm sure that it might develop into something that is at least interesting enough for people to want to read, even if you have a vague concept about these characters. So yeah, that's the end of the ramble. Let me know what your thoughts are on the Ultimate Universe line, which ones you actually read, what your favorite is so far. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.